and it hits me, oh my gosh, this is that triangle.
You know, there's explanation for everything that occurred in the Rendlesham Forest incident that doesn't involve aliens at all.
It was completely silent. It comes right over our heads.
He saw a classic flying saucer, really, standing in the clearing.
He turned over to my father and held his hand, and he looked in his eyes and he said, "We're not alone."
Welcome to Podcast UFO for our live show. We're live every Wednesday at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on the Dark Matter Radio Network. Please remember to visit the website podcastufo.com for past episodes, blogs, and forums. During the show, feel free to participate live in our chat room. And don't forget to like us on our very active Facebook page.
Hello, everyone. This is Martin Willis, your host, and we have another good show for you coming up this evening with our guest, Dr. Ardy Sixkiller Clarke, and she's going to talk about her new book and past books. And before we get into that, we're going to be having Alejandro Rojas from OpenMinds.tv, and he's going to talk to us about the latest UFO events and last year's total UFO events. He worked out some type of great graph for that, and he'll be talking about that coming up. So if you want to subscribe to us to hear the second hour, we are now 2 hours live on the Dark Matter Radio Network. But if you want to listen to the second hour as a podcast, you need to support us. And we're not asking too much, only like 23 cents a week. It's $1 a month. And all you have to do to access that is go to getjoyride.com/podcastufo. We have all that information right on our website. And if you have any problems or questions, you can email me at martin@podcastufo.com. We're going to be doing a shout-out later on this month and a contest for all the people that have helped us out at the $10 level to win a free T-shirt this month. And we're going to have some T-shirts printed up and ready out, and when we go out to Phoenix coming up in February. So it's time to bring on Alejandro with the news. What's going on, Alejandro?
Not much, just chilling.
Speaking of chilling, didn't you guys get a cold blast out that way?
Yes, we did.
Finally.
Yeah, it got down to 30 degrees in the middle of the night.
That's like unheard of, right?
No, it happens every year for a couple days. We have a couple days of freeze that's in the middle of the night, but it was still much warmer than Colorado, which is where I was during the Christmas vacation. So even in the middle of the night out here, but it did snow. So my girlfriend's daughter ran outside and was making freaky noises and running around, and I got a little bit of video. I think I posted a picture on somewhere, but in the middle of the night, there was a little bit of snow. I mean, it didn't stay on the ground at all. It just immediately melted, and it was mixed with rain. But there was a little bit of snow about a week ago in the middle of the night.
Doesn't Phoenix, close down when it snows, basically?
No.
Oh, you're prepared?
No. It just, if it were to really snow, but that was just for maybe an hour in the middle of the night, a few flakes that didn't even, stick to the ground. But, the surrounding areas, there are mountains around where the snow stays. And then, of course, there are further north, actually, just maybe an hour or two away. You've got standing snow. You have Flagstaff. You have Show Low, where, Travis Walton lives, and his whole experience went down. I mean, that's just like Colorado or something. It's the high country and higher country. And, it has actual full-on snowy winters.
Yeah, I know. Some of the highest snowbanks I've ever seen were in the Flagstaff area.
Really?
I went up through there in February a number of years ago. And, deep, deep snow. So it happens, but anyway, it's only going to be 12 degrees minus here tonight. So we're doing okay in the state of Maine. What's going on in the skies this last week?
Well, and I was going to say the skies here are sunny, and we're already in the 70s, so I didn't even have to wear a jacket this morning when I got out of bed. Really warm out.
Yep.
But in the skies, there are UFOs. UFOs. In fact, now that, the year is gone and it's been a little while, MUFON sent out their numbers, and I took all their numbers, as I usually do, for the year and crunched them, and I wrote a story about the top UFO hotspots for 2014. So what I did is I took the states, the countries, I totaled up all of the sightings, I put them in an Excel. From my corporate background, I know how to make pivot tables and graphs and all this fancy analytical stuff to see what's going down out there. So I listed the top states that have reported UFOs. However, those list very much like the top states with the highest population. So you have California, Texas, Florida, New York, all of those at the top. So what I also do every year is put that versus population. So in other words, I figure out reports per 100,000 person so that you really know how many places are having more UFO reports per person. And usually those came out pretty normal. You usually have Arizona, Colorado, Nevada towards the top. As you do this year, the Southwest is always up there. I think maybe because there's more clear skies. There's also more, Air Force bases and stuff like that. Could be that sort of thing. But who went to the top when I did per population? Oregon, surprisingly.
Really?
Yeah.
I thought you were going to say the great state of Maine. No. I bet you that's near the top, though, isn't it?
No, Maine is number 9. It is, yeah. It's number 9, so it is towards the top. So you guys are doing pretty good at there as far as UFOs go. But Oregon, and we've gotten a lot of people from Oregon email us over the years and say, oh, we see them all the time. It's not even a big deal out here. So we've heard anecdotally that there are a lot of sightings. Interestingly enough, when I look at our archives for UFO stories, there aren't many. In fact, this year, I don't think the media wrote about UFOs once in Oregon that I'm aware of. I don't think we've talked about Oregon as far as UFO stories. So it's surprising that it should reach the top like that. Otherwise, number 2 is New Hampshire, a little higher than usual. Then we have New Mexico, Nevada, Arizona, Alaska, Colorado, Missouri, Maine, and then West Virginia. So those were the top 10. But if you want to see your state, you can go to this story, and I listed every state in order. I also listed the countries. This is data based off of MUFON reports. MUFON's mostly in the United States. They do have chapters in other countries and work closely with our neighbors. Mostly they got reports from English-speaking countries. Of course, you probably have a lot of UK listeners. We do, and we're talking about MUFON a lot. So Canada and then the UK reported a few hundred. Also, India is pretty far up there. Interesting that they report to MUFON, and Australia. So lots of English speakers. And then I also looked at shapes. Spheres, circle, starlight are on the top, and then it comes to triangle. Disc shape is like number 7 or something, and it's in between other and unknown. So disc shape is not the most popular. Triangles are more popular, and of course this year we've talked about several really cool triangular-shaped light or picture UFOs cases and videos. So.
Yeah, I think the disc, the flying saucer, is it's going out of style. It's becoming vintage.
They're upgrading to a delta shape or an orb. And you know what we get a lot of, and I don't know that people realize this. It seems like, and I've heard anecdotally, personally in my life, this the most, and have seen this the most. What most people see is a star-like object, kind of like a satellite, but that just does very strange maneuvers, bobs around and then darts off. That seems to be very popular type of sighting.
Right. So, hey, that's great that you put all this effort into this list and break it down like that. That's very much appreciated, actually.
Thank you.
And that list will be linked in our show notes. Yes, sirree. So what else is happening?
Another big story that's really hitting the news right now, Jason got on really early, is this gentleman who uploaded to YouTube a video of what looks like a fireball or some sort of space junk coming into the atmosphere and breaking up. But then there's this little orb that kind of departs from it and cruises up. And it's a very strange video.
Right. It's like 42 minutes of blanked out space too, right?
It's actually more like 2 minutes of blank out space. It's about a 3-minute video. 30 seconds or 43 to be precise seconds are this sighting, and then it goes black, and the rest of the couple minutes is black, which is kind of weird.
It is.
I'm not sure why that's the case. The guy who posted it is named Ken Roberts, or that's the name of his YouTube accounts. When I looked at it, it didn't have very many hits. When I just looked at it earlier, just like within the hour, it's got over 1 million hits.
Oh, my God. You know, I sent that to Mark D'Antonio. You probably did, too. I haven't heard back from Mark yet on it, just to get his opinion of that, because that is incredible. And that's going to be, anyone listening can check that out through the link in our show notes as well.
Yeah, a lot of people feel that it's fake. This guy has not been in contact with anybody. The only person he was seemingly in contact with was someone who wanted to buy the video and asked to repost it and must have paid the guy. Otherwise, he hasn't talked to many people, and he's disabled comments. So that's kind of suspicious that he's not giving people more information. And a lot of the people, the D'Antonios of the world, are saying they think it's even CGI interesting enough. So we'll probably hear some more from people as time goes on. But yeah, a really interesting sighting that's making a lot of news right now.
Yeah, and if that is CGI, it's a pretty darn good job, I have to say. And it makes it tougher and tougher, doesn't it?
It does. I mean, it makes it, as we've talked about, it is harder and harder. And one person got frustrated and posted, why is it incumbent upon the person who takes the video to substantiate its reality? And it's like, well, whose job would it be then? And some people don't care. I took this video and you make of it what you want. And I can understand that because, just because you take a video doesn't mean you're any sort of video expert. But there are so many hoaxes out there that are so convincing. It's just really, really hard.
Right. Absolutely. And we have Hot Spots. Is that the one you already talked about?
That was the first one I talked about.
Okay.
The last story I was going to talk about, and we've kind of talked about it again, but this is another phase, and I think we ought to mention it. But this is Stephen Bassett of the Paradigm Research. He's done his citizens hearing Part 2, Phase 2 thing going on. And now he has added a petition to the We the People White House thing there again. This is the 7th time he's done this. And I think he was inspired because one time he was successful. The first time he did it,
That's
because
right.
back then you only needed 5,000 signatures. They keep raising it. Now you need 100,000 signatures to get any attention. The most he ever got was 12,000, so certainly a long shot. But yeah, he's done this several times. The first time he actually prompted a response from the science, the science guy in charge of science at the White House. I forget his full title. And they said that there is no proof of extraterrestrial life. So essentially he is now, the wording he is using is he's asking the Obama administration to support congressional hearings for government agency political witnesses to extraterrestrial related events and evidence.
Uh-huh. Well, maybe, I look at it this way, yes, this is his 7th time, but he's trying to do something, I give him an A for effort, that's for sure.
Yeah, I mean, he's out there, he's doing what he does. It gets attention, it gets news stories. I'm sure I haven't seen any on this, but there probably will be. I think it would be nice to see them kind of evolve. Like, I think it would be good to give them a reason, because it's like, okay, well, why? And there really is no why in here. But I think it would be good to emphasize why this would be important. But that would be helpful for people. But,
sure.
I guess, like you said, he's out there and he's doing his thing and bringing some awareness. And so we'll see what happens. Hopefully, it'd be great if it brought some people out of the woodwork that were some witnesses to some incredible stuff, some credible witnesses that could share some of their stories.
Absolutely. Well, that's it for the news today, right?
That is it for the news today.
Well, you stay warm out there. Don't.
I will.
Don't get too chilly in your light jacket, in your spring jacket.
Oh no, it was too warm for my jacket today, so I left it at home. But yeah, so.
All right.
You're the one who needs to stay warm, buddy.
I know. Hey, man, I'll talk to you next week.
All right, talk to you next week, buddy.
Have a good one.
Adios.
All right, we have a longtime listener and fan of the show sent us some music that he creates, and his name's Bruce Rainier. Thank you, Bruce. And after this clip, stay tuned for Dr. Ardy Clarke coming right up. Dr. Ardy Clarke, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yes, and for the person that is not familiar with your work, we're going to be talking about your book on Mesoamerica, and the name of the book is called Sky People, Untold Stories of Alien Encounters in Mesoamerica. I'm excited to talk about that, but can you give our listening audience basically your background, because you have quite an educational background and interesting one as well.
Well, I have a degree in English and a degree in history. I have a psychology degree, and I'm a licensed therapist and counselor. And I have a doctorate in school leadership. And I've been a high school English teacher, a counselor, a school administrator, a university administrator, and professor of educational leadership. And my 30 years at MSU, Montana State University, I was also the director of the Center for Bilingual Multicultural Education that served approximately 25 different Native American tribal groups throughout the Northwest region.
And you were really
even down into Arizona.
So you've been really immersed in the Native American culture as well over the years.
Oh yes.
Which
and that's my background too. I come from that heritage. So obviously, I have a tremendous interest in indigenous people as a whole. And that's what my first book focused on was Native Americans and in the United, in the 48 states plus Alaska, and then this book focuses on indigenous people in Belize, Honduras, Guatemala, and Mexico. Right,
and we'll be talking more about your first book in the second hour of the show. Now, what sparked your interest? To me, it seems to me that there's been a lot of history passed down in the Native American culture of Sky People. Did you somehow hear this in the beginning somewhere, in your travels. And is that what sparked your interest, or how did you get going on this subject?
Well, when I was a little girl, I heard the stories of the star people. But as all little girls, you go to college and, you put those stories aside and you begin your career. And when I came to Montana State as an assistant professor, back over 30 years ago now, one of my jobs as the director of the Center for Bilingual Education was to go out and to recruit Native American students to come to the university and to study teaching and educational leadership. Because when I first moved to Montana, there were very few Native American teachers teaching on the reservation. And our goal was to get a group of teachers that would return, Native teachers who would return to the reservation and teach and, set examples and be role models for students. And on my first trip out for recruitment, I stopped in this one village, and this person had agreed to serve as the organizer to bring all the students together from his reservation that were interested in teaching degrees. And I was offering scholarships as well. So I had written grants and gotten money from the federal government for this underserved population, and I could offer them scholarships. And so after I finished interviewing the students and giving them applications and everything, he asked me if I wanted to go out to dinner. So we drove to a neighboring town, and we had dinner. And on the way back, he said, if you got a few minutes, I'd like to show you something. And I said, sure. And so he took me up in the mountains on this narrow dirt road, and he said, now, if we're lucky, they'll come. And so he reached over and got a pair of binoculars, and we went out and we sat on this boulder overlooking his village, and he began to tell me about how the ancestors, the Star people, often come over his village. And I was just astounded because I had grown up hearing stories of Star people, but I had no idea that other tribal groups had similar stories. And so I began exploring that idea, looking for legends and talking to elders about ancient legends. And what I did is, in the process, I began collecting stories of contemporary encounters. And I was just fascinated at the stories that I was collecting. And I really was doing it as just a personal hobby. Even though I kept notes and I taped most of the stories. And after I retired from MSU, I was offered a year after I retired, or 2 years after, to be an evaluator of a federal grant that had been $5 million that had been funded on an Indian reservation. So I went to D.C. and I got trained by the officials back there to do the evaluation. And incidentally, that wasn't my cost, not the taxpayers or the project. I paid for it myself. And I went back there and got the training, and then the next week after I got back, I went to the reservation. And at noon that first day I was there, I was invited to participate in a luncheon with several of the native tribal leaders, female tribal leaders. And as we're sitting there talking, and something came up about a UFO that was seen on the reservation, or I'm not quite sure what brought it up. But anyway, I began telling them a couple of the stories that I had collected over the years. And this one lady looked at me and she said, "What are you going to do with those stories?" And I said, well, I really don't have any plans. And she said, well, what's going to happen to them after you pass? And I said, well, it'll probably be just thrown away. And she said, you know, you have a responsibility to write a book about this, because she said, this is our oral history, and it should be preserved. And I was really in a dilemma, because on the way back home, I knew I couldn't do both. I had just retired. You know, I'd only been out of retirement for a year. I couldn't do it. If I commit myself to a 5-year evaluation and write a book, and I thought, well, what is the most important? Well, there are a lot of evaluators out there, but there was no one that had the stories that I had. And so the next day I notified them that I really appreciated the offer, but that I wanted them to get another evaluator. And I sat down and started writing the book, and I've been writing ever since.
Wow. And so when you finished this book, which, again, we're going to talk about in the second hour, now, actually, the reason we're speaking tonight is because someone read that particular book and loved it and suggested that I contact you. This is a long-time UFO researcher. He's been at it for, in the 60s, I think, early 60s. Loved your first book and really enjoyed it. So you ended up, I read briefly, were in the Mesoamerican area, geographical area. You traveled 20-some-odd thousand miles
yes.
speaking to people.
Yeah, you know, after I retired at MSU, well, shortly before I retired, one of the things that I had always had in my mind when I was a teenager in a high school, a teacher handed me a book entitled Incidents of Travel in Central America, the Chiapas, and the Yucatan. And it was by a man named John L. Stevens. And Stephen Catherwood was the artist, the illustrator for this book. And Stephen Catherwood was an architect by trade and had traveled throughout the Middle East recording all the ancient architectural structures in the Middle East. And so when Stevens had heard about these ancient cities that were hidden in the jungle in Central America and Mexico, and he made a decision that he was going to go down there and find out if the stories were true. And he invited Catherwood to go along with him to draw these cities. And when I read the book, I just absolutely fell in love with this story. It just was mesmerizing. And I went back to my teacher and I said, when I grow up, I'm going to follow in their footsteps. I'm going to go to all those places. Well, she said, well, you know, you might want to read their second book. And it was Incidents of Travel in the Yucatan, and it chronicled their second trip. And it was only in Mexico that they traveled when they went the second time. The first time they landed in Belize City, which was at that time British Honduras. Now today Belize City is in the country of Belize. And there is a separate Honduras and Guatemala and Mexico. So they made that trip, and I followed their trip. But if I heard stories or had a particular interest, just like they did, I veered off of my plan and took off in another direction, which, as you know, often leads you to some of the most revealing stories of all. Mm-hmm. And so I decided that I was going to fulfill that teenage dream. And so I set off to do that and started out in Belize. I followed in their footsteps, or at least I should say what I did was I went to every single site that they had visited, if it still existed. And they visited something like 44, 45 sites, and I visited 89. So you can see that my my travel was much more extensive. But on the other hand, I traveled for 7 years to that part of the country, frequently, staying anywhere from 2 weeks to a month at a time to investigate, often embedding myself, in villages and staying so that people felt comfortable with me. And I played with their children, and I ate meals with them, and I attended ceremonies and went to funerals and went to wedding celebrations and all sorts of things so that people felt comfortable with who I was. And the stories began to emerge. And I can't begin to tell you how important it was for me to have the drivers and the guides and the interpreters who accompanied me or who I hired when I got to a particular site to assist me, because they were just invaluable in terms of providing me access, introducing me, validating me, and people, protecting me, basically. So it was an unbelievable experience.
It really sounds it. Now, how did you handle the language? I'm sure that you have had to deal with several languages.
I did, at least several dialects.
Dialects, yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, I also interviewed some Zapotec, so, the Zapotec language was mixed in there, and the Mixtec, who has a different language, and the Maya has several dialects. And how I handled that is one of the requirements for a driver was that they spoke English, Spanish, and at least one native dialect. And I had one guide that spoke 6 different dialects of the Maya language, as well as Spanish, English, and French thrown in. So, he was highly skilled linguistically. But if I came to a community where I didn't have a speaker, I hired somebody in that community who was a speaker. And it's rather interesting because throughout my travels, I ran onto people who spoke English, particularly younger people, because many of them had lived in the United States. I mean, several of my people I hired as drivers or guides or interpreters had lived in the United States, had come into the United States as illegals, but after they got a certain amount of money and were able to go home and build a small home for their mother or for their family, whatever, returned because they spoke of the fear of living here and being an illegal, and how they could never really relax because they were always afraid they were going to get caught. So they would come here and earn money and get out. And then with the benefit of the English language then at their disposal, they were able to get into the tourist industry or become a guide or a driver or whatever when people like me came along and needed assistance.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that helped out in that way. Now, were there parts of the places that you went where there was early, I don't know, it's sort of like tribal conditions, like people separated from the rest of society?
Well, the Lancandon Maya, who live, it's about maybe 40, 50 miles from Palenque, which is in the Chiapas, up in the mountains in the Chiapas. They were a group of the Maya who separated themselves so much from the rest of of their group, and have carried on their ways of life, their religion, their ancient practices, even until today. They still dress as they always did. They have long hair. Both the men, women, and children all have long, straight hair. not braided. It just falls down their back. They wear these, I'm not sure what they're made out of, but they look like homespun cotton gowns. They all dress alike, the men, women, children, and they it's just like a gown that comes down to their ankle, and just a hole with sleeves in it, short sleeves. I've met several groups in villages. Every village, when you get into the highlands and a lot of those mountain villages, they all have a distinctive way of dress. And I had people, women tell me, describe to me what their dresses meant, the symbolism behind their dresses. A lot of it has to do with the cosmos and the stars. And I met one group, and they live kind of, this village, they kind of almost live in a fort of seclusion. They have a history of murdering the only Catholic priest that ever came to their village. Huh? They defeated the Spaniards. Now, they were up in Oaxaca, and they defeated the Spaniards by pouring. They had this fort built around their village, and they literally would go up on top of the fort and pour boiling water and boiling oil over on the Spanish soldiers. No Mexican policeman is even allowed in this community. They have their own laws. And if you as a visitor, and they allow visitors to come, and of course you got to pay, and everything you do, you have to pay. You have to pay to get into the village. You have to pay to go to the church. And they allow that, but once you're in there, you're vulnerable to their laws. And if you do something you're not supposed to do, it can mean your life. And so my drivers and guides were very careful, say, do this, what to wear, what not to do, because, there's records of, people being killed, tourists being killed. And the police will not do anything about it because they have no authority, and the U.S. government won't do anything about it. So if you go into some of these, communities, and then, they have a history of exiling anyone within their community who marries outside their community. And I found that to be fairly common in some of those isolated villages in Oaxaca, particularly in the state of Oaxaca.
I'm sure. I want to apologize to people listening live. I understand through the chat room that the sound keeps dropping. I've been trying to reach the producer, and so he, when he gets back, and I'm sure he'll fix that. And again, I apologize. And if you are listening live, you are welcome to jump in the chat room if you'd like to pose a question to our guest. You just go to podcastufo.com. And it's a 2-click sign up. The chat room's right there on the sidebar. So let's jump right in and talk about one of the stories. I'd love to hear some of these stories, and it doesn't necessarily have to be your favorite one that you have, but I just want to hear a variety of what these people have been saying.
Well, let's start with Belize, because that's the first country I visited. Now, I had really no language problem in Belize, because Belize is an English-speaking nation, the only one in that part of the world. And I had heard a story when about a stone woman. And the local legend says around the end of the 1800s, a young man from the village went hunting, and as he approached the ancient city, which was the ancient, their village was not in the ancient city, but as he approached the ancient city, and he crossed the base of the Castillo, which is the pyramid, that beneath the base of the pyramid there was a cavern. And there, standing at the base of this pyramid, was this beautiful, statuesque Maya woman dressed in a long, flowing white dress. and that she had red glowing eyes, but that she did not move. That's how she earned the name the Stone Woman. Well, according to the young hunter, she sparkled in the rays of the rising sun, and he was so awestruck by her appearance that he threw his gun aside and he ran to the village and told the people all about this beautiful woman of stone. And several villagers, including the local priest or shaman, went to the site. And when they arrived there, they found the mouth of the cave, but the Stone Woman had disappeared. Well, occasionally the Stone Woman reappears, and I happened to be in that part of the world one time when there was a recent account of a local shaman reporting the Stone Woman was seen again, and that he saw her ascending to a large silver disc that hung over the ancient site. Others that witnessed the event said they saw her climb the pyramid and disappear inside a wall. And even though Stevens and Catherwood had not ventured to this site, I decided to take that trip because I wanted to get the lowdown, so to speak, on what was going on. And so my guide and I headed out to the village, and we the priest was not home, but she told us that we could find him at the ancient site. So in order to get there, you have to take this hand-cranked ferry over the Mopon River. And so we got on this ferry, and we cranked our way across the river, and when you're there, you're less than like a mile from Guatemala. It's that close to the Guatemalan border, but there's no road to get there. They estimate that this place was probably abandoned around 1000 A.D. Well, we located the shaman who agreed to tell us the story, and he explained that for several weeks, the residents had been seeing strange flying objects over the town. And the villagers called the objects circles that blocked the sun. And reportedly, there was a light radiating from underneath the craft, which pulsated from a bright yellow to a blinding blue light. But there was no sound coming from the craft, so they called it the circles that blocked the sun. And then after several weeks, the sightings had set the people on edge. And so he said that the people had spent much of their time in church praying because they weren't sure what was going on. And I asked him, I said, well, was this the time that the Stone Woman appeared? And he said, yes. And he said from the first time she was spotted, the elders talked about a strange flying machine that circled the sky. And I said, well, the stories of her originated in the 1800s. Did those stories also talk about a flying saucer? And he said, as long as he could remember, the elders have said the Stone Woman comes from the sky. And they said she is a sky woman. And I said, well, what can you tell me about the most recent event? And he said, well, it was a Sunday morning, and the people are headed to church when the craft came over the village at a very slow speed. And I said, well, can you tell me any details? And he said, well, it was round. It had no wings. And I said, well, did you see the one called the Stone Woman? And he said, I saw a woman, and she was magnificent. And he said she glowed like the stars. She was the most beautiful woman I've ever seen. He said she descended from the craft on a beam of light, and she stood at the entrance of the pyramid and walked inside the cave. And he said when she emerged, she climbed to the top of Castillo, and a beam of light came down, and she entered the craft just as she had emerged from it. And I said to him, I said, well, were you the only witness? And he said, well, there were several others. But some of them said she walked inside the pyramid and disappeared. But he said, I know the truth because I avoided her eyes. And I said, well, what do you mean you avoided her eyes? And he said, she has red glowing eyes, and she has the ability that if you look at it into her eyes, she has a power over you that makes you see what she wants to see. And he said, so I knew that. And so I didn't look in her eyes, and so I was able to see what was actually going on, where she made the other people see what she wanted them to see. So that was the story of the Stone Woman of Belize. And, you know, based on an ancient story, I asked him, I said, do you believe the original story that she was a woman of stone? And he said, I don't believe she was. He said, I think the young hunter who first saw her was so dazzled by her beauty, she made him think she was a woman of stone. He said, the people from the stars have great powers, more than those of us on earth. And he said, I believe she is a living, breathing star goddess who cast a spell on those who saw her and made them believe what she wanted them to believe. And he said she was taller than our women. She had black hair that flowed down the back to her waist. She wore a long white dress with embroidery. And but he said, I wasn't close enough to recognize the designs of her embroidery. And as I mentioned before, that was very important because each village has its own way of dress in many parts of that of Mesoamerica that identifies where they're from. And as I said, the women, you know, to us they may look like floral designs or abstract designs, but the women tell me that in the old days, the traditional way of embroidering your dress had to do with your connection with the cosmos and the star system. So that was one of the stories I thought that was interesting. I met a man in Belize who told me that he had a double on another planet, that he had actually been cloned, and for the purposes. And he grew up with this child who was his clone, and this clone learned everything from him. And then the idea being that the spacemen were literally populating another planet. And he was going to be one that they would use, but his clone would be a part of that population. So some interesting stories out of Belize.
Yes, and let's go into some of the other countries. Well, let me ask you this. This just occurred to me. Were there commonalities in some of these stories spread apart in different areas and different countries as you were traveling?
Well, you know, I think, you know, sometimes the description of the aliens they encountered, or the description of the craft, but there were similarities with other stories that you've heard in the U.S., like the different kinds of aliens. I think we could say some of them were the tall whites, and some of them were the little gray men, and some of them were lizard-like men, or more lizard than human, or you know, human-like. But and then I heard stories of women being abducted and impregnated, but not necessarily. You know, it ran the whole gamut of different kinds of things that, you know, to say the only commonality would be the encounters, you know, that they had encounters, but they varied so distinctly.
Right. And when you were also speaking to the people there, were there any incidents that happened, you know, fairly, you know, not that long ago? Like, in other words, a recent encounter?
Well, there was one encounter that occurred, you know, in Honduras when I was there. And I was staying in this kind of boutique hotel. My driver from Belize had taken me to Honduras, to Copan, which it was the first site that Stevens and Catherwood had visited. And so my plan was, I had arranged for a driver to pick me up in Copan and take me to Guatemala. But I did not have a driver once I got to Copan, because the city is actually called Copan Ruinas, and then the ancient site is called Copan. To me, it felt like it should have been the opposite, but that's the way it was. And there were enough people there who spoke English too, because there is a bilingual school there that teaches English and Spanish. And what's interesting is they attract all of these students, these English-speaking students from all over the world, particularly from the UK, to come there and teach in their school for minimum rewards, and I think perhaps room and board. And these kids are all learning English. And I had a lady approach me and say to me that, she said, if you go into Copan at night, if you go into the site at night, the ancestors will come if you are indigena. And she said, you are indigena. I said, yes, USA. And she said, well, the priest said you would come. And I said, are you talking about the Catholic priest? And she said, no, I'm talking about our priest in my village. She says, I live in the mountains, up away from the city. And she began to tell me that they had fallen on hard times. And this was around 2008 when the economy had really tanked. And people weren't traveling as much to that part of the world. And their economy had suffered because the people there depend so much on the tourist industry. And so she told me that their priest had said that a woman was coming from the north, El Norte, and that this woman was going to be very kind. And she said, I know you're that woman. And I said, well, I know I'm not. I can't be that woman. I'm just a professor. I'm not anybody. And she said, oh no, you are. She said, I see how you treat people. I see how you talk to the children. I see how you leave tips. I see how you speak to people. So she just insisted that I was the woman that her priest had predicted would come to their village. And she said, tonight my brother will come for you, and he will take you into the city. And if you have a kind heart and you are that woman, the ancients will come. And I said, well, who are the ancients? You mean the star people? And she said, see, they will come. And so about midnight, her brother, Teodoro, knocked on the door, and he led me into the jungle. And we climbed this pyramid in the dark, and we sat there, and I could hear the bats, below, and I could see the stars that just seemed, unbelievably bright, sitting there on that pyramid. And he says, now we wait. And along before dawn, all of a sudden these lights appeared, and they were like they were cavorting in the plaza. And there were several of them, maybe 20, just almost like they were dancing. They were, and Teodoro says, they're here. And then one of them broke away from the rest of the group and came right in front of me. And the others lined up behind this light. And then all of a sudden, the sun came up, and they disappeared. And I looked up overhead, and there was a wheel-like craft circling above the plaza. It covered the entire space. Now, one of the plazas, I forget, is what, 4 or 5 football, size of 4 or 5 football fields. It was rotating very slowly, and then all of a sudden it accelerated and it took off and was gone. Well, I'm just dumbfounded, and my guide, Teodoro, says, "You're one of us." And so we're walking back to the village, and he's trying to say, "Will you go with me tomorrow night?" And I said, "Well, I'm a driver is coming for me this morning. I'm on my way to Guatemala." And so he made me promise that I would return, because he says, "You have brought prosperity to our village," because this is what the priest said, that when this woman from the north would come, she visited with the ancients, that when the ancients appeared to her, that meant that the village would be prosperous again. And so when we were driving out of the village, I remember my driver saying to me, "Did you see the UFO last night?" And he said, "I was in Guatemala, and we saw it, and it was headed toward Copan." And I didn't even respond to him, because I'm thinking about what I had just seen. We got to Guatemala City. I was so exhausted. I had dinner, went to the hotel, and went to bed. And the next morning, I found out that craft, I assume it was the same craft, had circled over the hotel that night. And there were probably 20 or 30 people who had witnessed this craft that I described to you. It was the same one they described to me, that had hovered over the hotel that night, and had actually taken one of the waiters on board the craft. So his story is also in the book.
Wow. So we're just about 3 minutes away from the top of the hour. And so just one question came up on the message board, and it would be nice to get the answer from you. Any of these people that were having these encounters, did they claim to receive any message from the beings that they encountered?
The only messages, and this only came from maybe 2 or 3 of the people, was that the people had not taken very good care of the earth, and that in the future we would have to pay the consequences for our mistakes.
Boy, I'll tell you what, you hear that you heard that in the South African Rwanda, I believe that's what it was.
And even in the Native American, I've heard that.
Yeah, you hear it everywhere, and that's something that really makes you wonder. And it's actually common sense as well. We are ruining our planet. So it's just that we're in a society that lives for today. And I brought this up, before when we were talking about nuclear power. We use like the power we need for just today, but we put the burden out there for 250,000 years of people to take care of the waste, that type of stuff. So, we're not treating our planet very nicely, that's for sure.
And that's basically the message that I heard from the people.
Mm-hmm. Well, we just got a couple minutes left in this hour. Before we jump into the next hour and talk about the Native American culture and your first book, is there another quick story you can tell us from one of the people?
Well, in Honduras as well, I met this elder, and he spoke English, perfectly, and I asked him how he had learned English so well, and he said that when he was a small boy, he said, "I was born in 1904." And he said, when I was 5 years old, Herbert Spindon. And Herbert Spindon was the assistant curator of anthropology at the American Museum of Natural History in New York. And Herbert Spindon came to Copan, and he spent 20 years there, from 1909 to 1929. So Luis was 5 years old when he first arrived there. And he said, and he was, at the time I interviewed him, he was 99 years old. He said, I worked at this site for almost 75 years. And he said, Spindon was the first to hire me. And he said, mostly in those days, I was a runner. I would go get him water, and I would bring lunches to the site. And he said, I worked all day for 10 cents a day. And he said, but Spindon told me that if I learned English, he would pay me more money. And he says, by the time I was 8, I spoke English. And he raised my salary to 25 cents a day. And he paid me 25 cents a day until he left. And he said, then the Carnegie scientists came to excavate and restore the city. And he said, they paid me 50 cents a day because I could speak English. And he said that on the weekends when the scientists took time off, he and his friends would go up into the mountains above Copan. And, you know, I'm talking about really extensive mountain ranges in that area, and they would go up into those mountains, and there were a lot of caves, and they would go into these caves to see if they could find any artifacts, because if they did, they would bring them back, and the archaeologists would pay them for them. They would buy them from them. And he said, I was about 11 or 12, and he said, we would go up there, and he said, my cousins and I found this skeleton of a man in a silver suit. And he said his suit was silver from the top of his head to the bottom of his feet. And he said, but all that remained inside the suit was a skeleton. And he said from the size of the suit, he was a small man. And I estimated, because he was motioning how tall he was, that he was probably about 1 meter tall. And he said his head was covered in a hard metal-like tube. And he said there were strange tablet beside him and with strange characters on it. And he said it was not Mayan writing because we knew what Mayan writing looked like. And he said this writing was foreign to us. And he said when we showed it to the archaeologists, they didn't know what it was either. And I said, well, tell me more about the helmet. And he said, well, the best he could describe it, it was like a large coffee can, but that was the shape of it, but it was bigger than a coffee can. And he said it was attached to the suit, and it had a hose that attached to the front of the suit. And he said there were different colored buttons on the front of the breast of the suit. And I said, well, what did you do with it? And he said, well, we carried it back to the archaeologists, and he said they were really excited. He said they took it into one of their tents, and they began examining this and examining it. And he said he heard one of the archaeologists say that they had to send it back to the USA immediately. And he said, the next day I saw a box in the tent. And he said, I think they packed him up and shipped him to their university. And he said, I never saw him again. And he said, all of my life I have felt guilty about the Silver Man. And he said, I'm sure the scientists in the USA have studied and restudied him, but they keep it a secret. And he said, I believe it's proof that alien exists, don't you? And he said, I feel so bad because it was such an important part. Now that I'm an old man, he says, I know it was such an important part of proving the Maya connection with the stars. And then he went on to tell me that his grandfather always told him about these men who came from the stars and who lived in the mountains sometimes for months, and that they never bothered the people in the village, so the people in the village never bothered them. And he said they came in silver discs that spit fire, and the men wore silver suits. And he said, I think we discovered one of those who died on one of those visits, and they buried him in a cave, and we disturbed his gravesite. So,
wow.
Again, that's an amazing story.
It really is. Well, that's it for this part of the show, and we'll be back. What's the name of the book we're going to be discussing in the second half of the show?
Encounters with Star People.
It's Native American, basically, yes?
Right. It's on stories I collected in the U.S.
Welcome back, and if you're listening live and you just joined us, we are live with Dr. Ardy Sixkiller Clarke, and we have been talking about her travels through Mesoamerica, and now we're going to be talking in this hour about the Native American culture and her first book. And if you are listening live, I do apologize. There is some intermittent issues with the sound. The producer, Keith, is trying to get that fixed as soon as possible. Up on the message board, if you scroll up, you'll see a link to another site where people are claiming the sound is clear on that and not breaking up. So just go to our message board, scroll up, and you'll see the link to that. I think it's I can't remember what it's called, iTunes Radio or something like that, where this is playing as well. But anyway, welcome back, Ardy, and let's talk about your travels in Native America. And to me, this is I actually have some Native American blood in me, and both great grandmothers on one of my father's side and one of my mother's side were both full blood Native American, and so I've always had an interest in this, and I've listened to. I actually used to have a property that used to be part of a park where I used to have powwows every year, and I had a blast. People came from all over the country, and you never even knew they were there when they left. The place was spotless every year. So anyway, I've enjoyed that culture a lot over the years, and love the stories, not only the stories about Star People, but so many traditions that have been handed down generation after generation. And so let's talk about that and how you started that book. And I'm going to ask you kind of an oddball question. What was your first interview that you did in relation to that book?
Oh, gee, let me think about that for a second.
Put you right on the spot, didn't I?
Yeah, because, I collected so many stories, and I didn't necessarily, I think,
well, we can change gears here and just, let's just talk about
It's just so many stories, and,
Sure.
and try to figure out which one happened first.
And that was kind of like I said, it was an off-the-cuff question, but let's just change the question to how did the book start formulating? Because obviously you said you collected stories long before. So how did you start putting that together? And how do you...
Well, whenever I decided I was going to write a book, I just, I had shoeboxes full of tapes and I had them organized and my notebooks numbered, and so I just started back through and started going through everything and saying, well, this will be a good story to tell, and this one will be a good story to tell. And so after I got to about 30 stories, I just sat down and started writing. And I think the first story that I recorded was a story of that I called the Traveling Marble. I met this couple. I had stopped off at their place. I had been visiting some elders in the region, and I stopped off at their place when I heard that their place, their ranch, had frequent sightings of UFOs. And I went over and I introduced myself to them, and I had previously met Cynthia, who was and she was married to a rancher, Ivan, and I had met her because she was a teacher, and they had 4 children. And she invited me to come visit them. When I arrived at their place, they invited me in and said, won't you join us for dinner? They were getting ready to have dinner. And I asked them, I said, well, I'm here because I've heard that you have the UFOs come to your ranch. And they said, well, our ancestors live among the stars, and they keep watch over us, and they're the keepers of this planet. And we believe that the Milky Way was created by the star beings as a trail to guide us after we die as our way to return to the heavens. The same thing, you hear that in the Maya culture, because the Maya, after they go through the underworld, go to Chimalba, which is, you cross the Milky Way to get to Chimalba, which is a heaven of sorts. And I asked her, I said, well, have you had personal contact with the star people? And she says, well, we've both seen them more than once. She said, sometimes they come and they take water out of our lake, or they just hover over it, and you can see the water rise into the craft. It's like a downpour going upward, she said. And she says, I said, well, has anyone else in your family or any of your friends seen them? And she said, our children saw them all the time when they were growing up. And she said, but they got used to it, so it was normal for them. And Ivan goes on to tell me that Indians had always had a relationship with star beings. And that, so to see a UFO on the reservation was not something that was shocking to them, because the aliens weren't alien to them. They were a part of the universe and a part of the cosmos, and they are ancestors and our keepers, and they watch over us. And while I was there, their daughter stopped by to visit, and we walked down to the lake where they said that the UFOs would come and get water. And the daughter said, they landed near the lake sometimes, back in the trees. And she said, this one time, Mom and Dad were gone. And she said, I don't remember where they'd gone, or maybe they were out working in the fields. She said, because Dad raised hay and alfalfa for the horses and cattle. And she said, on this particular day, the star people came. And she said, it was late in the evening, but it was still daylight. And she said, Harold and I watched them land. Harold was her brother. And she said, we decided to go down to the lake and see if we could talk with them, even though we knew that we were not supposed to do that. And she said, when we got there, we stood outside the spacecraft and we waited patiently until a door slid open. and 2 star beams came out, she said. I remembered I waved, just a little wave, she says. And one actually waved back to me. And Harold went to him and handed him a marble. And she said, then the star people, they turned and disappeared inside the spacecraft. But the starman, she said, kept Harold's marble. And we were so excited. She said we ran. I was really upset, though, with my brother because I didn't know that he was going to take something to give to them, or I would have taken something too. And she said that after they left, she says, many nights we would lie outside on a blanket and stare at the stars and pretend that we knew where that marble might be, and make believe. And when I asked her to describe the space travelers, she said, well, they were smaller than most Indian men. Well, in her tribe, the Indian men, are tall, probably 5'10" to 6'2". And she said maybe they were about 5 feet tall, and they had light skin, and they wore dark brown one-piece suits, she said. She said their bodies were very thin, and she assumed they were men because they didn't have breasts like human females. And they never spoke, and they didn't make any sound. And I said, well, what about their eyes? And she said, I really don't know. She said they had these very strange-looking big glasses on, and I remember thinking I wished I had a pair of those glasses, that everybody would be jealous if I had a pair of those glasses. And she said, we got a good look at the craft. We walked around it, and we counted off the steps, and it took us 44 steps to get around it. And she said, but now remember, we were 9 or 10, so our steps were smaller than a foot. But it was still a pretty big craft, she said. She said there was no opening for a door, but when the craft opened, that's why they were so surprised. And the opening was like a V, and it was like the sides just opened up, and then when they went back in, it closed. She said it was like one piece. We couldn't see inside. So later that evening, when I was going back to town, she followed me in, and she called her brother, and she invited her brother to join us at the Dairy Queen. And her brother came down, and basically he told the same story, and she did not alert him at all that she had told me this story. He told me how he had told her, Lydia, that he was going down there, and he was just going to check out things, and he said when that panel opened and the 2 beings climbed out, he said, I don't remember what I didn't know what to do. And he said, that's when I was so nervous. And he said, when I handed him this marble, and he took it and looked at it and closed his fingers around it and climbed back into the craft and flew away. I thought I was going to faint, he said. And he talked about how they made up stories about the marble and tried to figure out which planet or star it might be visiting. And he said, but Lydia never forgave me for giving him a marble because she wanted to give him something to take to the stars, too. And talked about the repeated times they had seen the UFOs. How it was a commonplace event. And I think that was probably one of the first stories I collected, as I recall.
Boy, I'll tell you, that is quite a story too. And
I think I called it the story of the traveling marble or something, because that was just fascinating to me. And they were just so innocent, that he just reached in his pocket and gave him a marble,
I have heard that story, and I'm just trying to remember, was that part of a documentary or something?
Not that I know of.
Because I definitely...
If it is a part of a documentary, somebody's telling my story, because this is an original story.
Yeah. It may not have been a marble, but it was a story very, very similar, and I definitely have heard that in the past. and I just can't remember exactly where. Unless I listened to a show you were being interviewed on at some point, that could very well be the same thing, you know. And so where and when did this happen?
Well, this would have happened in the 80s or early 90s.
I see.
Yeah.
And what part of the country was that in?
Well, it was in the Northern Plains. You know, one of the things that, in order to get people to talk to me, I agreed that I would not divulge the location.
I see.
One of the biggest fears that Native people have is if they tell their stories, that all of these researchers will come around, and not only will they anger the tribal council and the people in power, but that they will also just make a nuisance of themselves, demanding to see the site where it occurred, bring their cameras, and they just don't want to deal with it. And I don't blame them.
Right. Yeah, I don't either. Going back to, let's just stay right on this same story for a minute. First of all, you hear of other stories where water is drawn up from a lake, which only makes sense if water is the common thing that life needs. And up on the message board, someone wanted to know what type of craft did they say that it appeared to be, and did they say why they were visiting? And
they didn't have, as far as I know, they did not tell me of any communication they had, other than the wave, the shy-like wave that she talks about waving to them. And then he gives them the marble, and then they go away. There's no you know how some of the people talk about communicating with them mentally. There was none of that. It was just that the marble was given and they left. And the craft was circular. As I said, they walked around it, and they said they counted their steps, 144.
Uh-huh. And, another thing you mentioned in this, or they mentioned in this story, the way the door closed, and then you saw... And
they said there were no seams.
Right.
It was like a one piece.
Yes, and that's something I've heard numerous amounts of times. And that could just be another part of a physical technology that we haven't figured out yet to make something like that.
When I was down in Mesoamerica, I had elders tell me that the means of travel of these sky gods or star people is so far beyond our knowledge. They more than one of them told me that they had the star people have the ability to literally be in one place and think of another place and be there. That's how their travel operates. That it's not with propulsion and it's not with gallons of fuel. They simply think of a place and go there.
Well, that makes just as much sense as them getting here. You know what I mean?
Right.
People always say it's impossible for them to get here, and so I guess you could look at it that way. A question up on the message.
And I also, this story will be in my next book, but I interviewed a man who told me about the Universal Highway. And he said the Universal Highway, there's different ports of entry of the Universal Highway. And they're all over the world. And he had entered one when he was in the military in Iraq and had been offered by the star people to take him to safety because he was in battle. And he was in a city because his unit had been sent there because they had been told that Saddam Hussein was perhaps hiding out in this city. And so they had sent them in, and of course they were immediately, it was an ambush, and they were trapped, and he was looking for some means of cover from the snipers in the building across the street from him. And he stumbled into this abandoned building and was suddenly on what was in this tunnel, which was the Universal Highway. And he talked about being taken by this starman down this long tunnel and coming into an area that was would have held, he said, the largest aircraft that the military owned, and the craft was a circular craft was there, and they offered to take him to safety, to take him home. And he told them that he could not do that because he couldn't. He would be identified as a deserter at least, but more importantly, he couldn't desert his unit. He couldn't betray his fellow soldiers. And they were fascinated with that idea because they couldn't understand the concept of betrayal and why he would want to put himself in harm's way. And when he refused to go with them, they told him they would be back the next day, and that if he wanted to go with them, for him to come. But he said he didn't. And then he told me, he said, now, there's a place near Chinle in Arizona. There's a place in West Virginia. There's a place in Montana. And in Montana, there are records of the Blackfeet Indians, have had a number of stories about this special place up on the Canadian border where you could step into another dimension, and in fact, this is where I met this man who told me, was telling me this about being in the military and what happened to him, and he said that, but this white guy had written about it back years ago when he said that he went there and he stepped into another dimension and saw a completely different world. Well, according to the man I interviewed, this is actually the entry port into the Universal Highway, and he said that the Universal Highway is connected to all of these different planets. It has ports, entry ports all over the world, and that that's how many of the spacecraft travel, is on this Universal Highway. And they talk about an invisible tunnel that exists. And they said there's one in West Virginia, there's one in Chinle, and I told him that I met a man in Hawaii who told me about this same thing, about this Universal Highway. And he said, and this was on Maui, out in the section of on the road to Hana, which is a remote part of Maui, and there's one in Peru. He said, I believe he said there was one in Puerto Rico, but that there are places all over the world where you can walk into the entryways to if you know what you're looking for. So
kind of goes back to people talking about portholes and
right, portals, right?
Yeah. And
well, there's an ancient story in Peru about that when the Spaniards were destroying the Inca Empire, that the great leader of the Inca nation just walked into a portal and just disappeared. And it's still considered a sacred place in Peru.
There's a pretty interesting question. Hang on just a second.
Okay.
A lot of people, here it is right here. What is the natives' definition of the terms star seed or star child?
I've never heard them use the term star child at all. That is something that has, in the hundreds and hundreds of interviews. Now, in their stories, in their ancient stories, they tell of women who went to the stars and bore children and who came back and with a child, and that child had the capabilities of the earth person. Could look like an earth person, but had tremendous powers. Could move mountains, could create rivers, could change the whole terrain, and they were often called the Star Boy or the Thunderer or something of that nature. But as far as any contemporary belief in star children, as I understand, now star seeds. The seeding I've heard about is the seeding that is done on planets. I've had, particularly down in Mexico, I had stories about elders who told me that the star people travel the universe, and if they find a planet that is compatible to life, or if they can do some kind of variations, that they can create atmospheres, they can seed the planet. And that's the seeding I've heard, where they seed the planet and they make it livable, and then they populate the planet. Okay. With clones.
Yeah, you hear all kinds of these things. Let's talk. I want to hear some more stories, because that marble story was great. And were there any stories that even came close to that? I mean, what one? That's a great one to start out with.
I had known this elder for about 30 years. When I first went to Montana State University, one of the things I had a reputation of as a grants writer, and that I could write grants. When I had been in the Rapid City schools, I was working in the Rapid City schools, and my first day on the job, the district had been cited as being out of compliance with the federal law, and because of my background in English, the district had me trained in this compliance law down in Denver, and then requested that I write their compliance agreement with the federal government, because what the federal government was doing was holding all their federal dollars. And this is something that I started doing for other school districts that were in trouble, so my reputation had preceded me when I came to MSU, that I could write grants and I could do different kinds of things. And so the school district contacted me and asked me if I would come and help them write a grant, because they needed funding for something. And so I went to the reservation, and my contact there was a cultural specialist, and he didn't like it that they had invited me to come there, because he didn't think they needed any outside help. And besides, who was I coming there? I wasn't even from their tribe, and so he was very suspicious of me. And but over the years, we became great friends, and I had known him maybe 20, 25 years before he said to me, he said one day, he said, "You collect stories about star people, don't you?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "I've heard people call you the UFO lady." And I laughed, and he said, "Well, I have a story to tell you." But he says, "You're going to have to take a trip with me tomorrow morning, because I'm going to have to show you where it occurred, because I can't describe it accurately without you seeing it." So the next morning, he picked me up at my motel room, and we went out probably 60 miles from the town where I was staying, and on gravel roads, and we got to the turnoff to his place, and there wasn't even a road there. You just had to go out through fields and down over hills and gyp dirt, and whenever it rained, you couldn't get out of there because the gypsum that's what they make soap suds out of. So you can imagine trying to drive through muddy gypsum. And his place was on a huge river. And he began telling me the story that this was a place he had inherited from his grandfather, and that at one time his grandfather had a spacecraft. Now, this was before Roswell. Spacecraft crashed on his grandfather's property. And that when it came to, his grandfather thought it was an earthquake because he was inside the house when it occurred, because he said the ground shook and his whole house shook. But it lodged inside a butte across the river from where his grandfather's house set. His grandfather's house set up on a butte overlooking the river, and this spacecraft had gone into, and only the back part of the spacecraft was showing. But there were 17 beings inside that craft, and they were stranded. There was no way to repair their craft. But they were able to camouflage the craft in such a way that people could not see it. And his grandfather, the man who was telling me the story, he would say, that he would go there every summer and stay with his grandfather. Both of his parents had jobs with the tribe, and so when school was out, they would take him and deposit him, with a paper bag filled with some paperback books, and a change of clothes, and he went to his grandfather to spend the summer. And when a week before school started, they would come back and get him new clothes, and then get him ready for school. And he said this was the way it was from the time he started school and through high school. But anyway, he said that one summer when he arrived there, his grandfather told him about, the spacecraft that had crashed, and said they took him down, and they went across the river, and he said he climbed into this spacecraft, and he found a way in, and he talks about he sat in one of the chairs. He said there were 19 chairs, but he said his grandfather said there were only 17 beings that he counted. And his grandfather came to understand that they wanted to stay there. They asked his permission to stay there until they were rescued. And they said it would be like 3 months before someone could get there to come for them. And his grandfather said that was fine. And in fact, his grandfather took on kind of a protective role. He didn't want anybody going down to the river. He didn't want anybody around. And fortunately, his closest neighbor was 4 miles away, and they had gone to Mississippi for the winter, and was not even around because they had a son-in-law from Mississippi. But anyway, he said that he was the only one there within miles. But if anyone came to visit him, he'd kept them away from the river because he wanted to protect these starmen. And so this little boy tells about, by the time he got there, the starmen were gone. But he talked about going into the craft. There were 19 chairs there, but there were only 17 living beings. So he didn't know if 2 had died or there were simply only 17 on the craft. He said when he sat down in the chair, it closed around him, and it made him very frightened because he wasn't thinking that he was not going to be able to get out of there. But he said then when he just thought, it opened up. And when he thought, I want to get up, it opened up. And so he sat back down again, and it closed around him. He thought again, I want to get up, and the chair opened up. So he was really fascinated with that. He talked about finding these vials of a slimy substance that he said that it smelled like rotted grass or something of that nature, and and he wanted to take a sample, and his grandfather said, "No, that's sacred. You must leave that there. You know, we are not allowed. We cannot disturb this sacred place." He told me that his grandfather talked about they had the kind of suits that when you went in the water, they never got wet, and that his grandfather, all of his life, he wanted one of those suits, and he couldn't figure out what kind of suit that they were wearing. He talked about taking going hunting and taking food to them, and they told him they didn't eat food as Earthman ate food.
That's pretty convenient. And, maybe that's why you always hear them being so thin. No.
Well, and maybe, they have perfected a way of just using some kind of vitamins or something. Maybe that's what he found was their food, those vials he was talking about.
Oh, yeah, and there's always been speculation.
And he said that his grandfather said they had the ability to vanish in thin air when he said when he first encountered them, they would just disappear right in front of him. But then after they became more comfortable around him and saw that he wasn't going to harm them, then they didn't do that. He said they told him that there was a spaceship, a huge spaceship that had been that was up in the sky, and that there were 4 small spacecraft that had come out of it that were exploring the Earth. They came out of the bigger ship, and he said they said that they had to wait until one of those ships came back. They were on. They were 3 months they would be exploring, and then they would go back to the ship. And he said that's when they will discover that we have crashed, and they will come for us.
You would think that they would have a communication, very...
Well, perhaps they did, but, he didn't. I don't know. That's what the grandfather told the grandson, that they had to wait. He said that they took him on board their craft. They showed him pictures from their home. In something like what I would describe as a TV or a computer, but in his grandfather's day there was no such thing, because keep in mind this was 1945, and he hadn't seen any computer, so he called it a picture machine. He talked about flashing pictures that showed a place that was very different from Earth, and he said that if he had to pick a place on Earth that it reminded him of, it would be the Badlands, because there was no vegetation. And he said they told him their houses were underground. And he said he asked them about heaven, and they told him they did not have a place such as heaven. He said he went back several times to ask if he could see the picture machine, and they agreed to let him look at it every time they went. The visitors told him that they really liked the green of Earth, and they thought the red willow that grew along the banks of the river was quite beautiful, and that they loved water. They said on their planet water was underground, nothing was on the surface. And he said his grandfather would take them geodes. Do you know what a geode is?
Oh, yeah. Huh.
And they would take him. He would go out into his fields, and he would gather these geodes on his ranch. And he said they were just so amazed when he broke them open to reveal the crystallized cities inside, the geodes. And they wanted them. They wanted to add them to their collection. But then there's more to this story, because what happened is that a couple of years later, the Corps of Engineers came in and decided to build a dam. And when they decided to build the dam, they asked his grandfather to leave his ranch because they were going to be blasting, and they were building that dam basically for recreational purposes. So that upset him, but they paid for them to stay in a motel in a neighboring town. And he was telling me, he said, we had 2 double beds and a free meal pass at the local restaurant, but he said his grandfather was like a caged animal, and he hated the motel and he hated the restaurant. And he said that they spent hours walking dirt roads out of town, and he worried about his horses and his cattle. And he said, I read him Western paperback books, and we played checkers a lot. And he said that then when they let him go back to the ranch, it was near the end of July, and he said that I remember it took most of August to round up the horses and cattle for the winter, and he said, I was worried I wasn't going to be able to help him get the job done before school started. And I said, well, did the place change? And he said, well, when we arrived, the landscape was totally changed. He said they had literally moved mountains of dirt, and where there was once a hill, there were now where there was once a field, there were now hills, and it was impossible to even figure out where the butte had been, where the spacecraft had landed, because now the water had flooded that whole region. And he said if the spacecraft were still there, it would have been underwater, but his grandfather was convinced that the military found the craft. And because he said that one day the engineers came to his house and they talked to him about how inaccessible the ranch was and had he ever seen anything strange. And he said his grandfather wasn't about to tell him anything, and his grandfather just said, nothing ever happens out here. But he felt they were asking him these questions because they had found that crashed UFO. And he said, regrettably, he was never able to return because he said it was underwater, and he said they had changed the terrain so much he wasn't even sure if he'd ever be able to find it. And he said that, I said, well, how would they get some? And he thought they had taken it out of there. His grandfather was sure that they had discovered it and had taken it out of there. And he said, well, you got to keep in mind that this was back in the days that there were cars on the reservation, and he said when all this big equipment started coming in, people would stand along the side of the road just to watch it go by. And he said you could have brought anything in and out of the reservation, and nobody would have known what it was. And so he thinks, at least his grandfather believed, that they had found the spacecraft, the military had come in and had taken it out and simply drove it off the reservation, covered it up perhaps, and nobody ever knew any difference.
Really?
But that was an amazing story. And especially since it happened, before Roswell.
Yeah, that really is something. That was quite the story. Now, did they ever talk about, how they communicated?
Well, I asked him that, and he said that his father said that he just thought a question and they answered it in his head.
Just like
so that would be telepathy.
Yeah. Yeah, that is quite the story. An amazing
and I've heard, that's a common way I've heard a number of indigenous people describe how they communicate. He says they just talk to me, and the words are in my head, or they talk to me in my head. I know one was telling me how he had to practice asking a question because they told him he didn't. In fact, one elder was telling me that they find the English language, the sounds of the English language, quite offensive. And so they told him, just think the question. Don't say the question.
Please, leave us alone. Yeah, that's pretty funny.
So it was kind of interesting that just think the question, and he says, and he had to adjust to thinking the question.
So this, you said this was about 10 years ahead of Roswell, or some?
No, about
just some
2
time?
years.
2 years ahead of Roswell.
Yeah.
Yeah, isn't that amazing? Well, people don't talk about it much, but, if you talk to a skeptic out there or a lot of people out there that are looking, seriously at the UFO topic, most people say that, nothing happened prior to Roswell of any consequence. But, if you really look into the subject deeply, you'll see that, there's been encounters of some kind going back for centuries that are noted.
Oh, yeah. I mean, even here in Montana we have those stories. Joan Bird, has written a wonderful book called UFOs in Montana.
Oh, yes.
And, she chronicles the history of UFOs in this state. And they go back to the days of the trappers and the first white men that came to this region,
Now, do you actually know Joan, by the way?
Oh, yes. Yes,
well,
she and I are friends.
That's what I'm going to. This is live on the air, but I'm still going to say this. I had communicated with Joan, and she was going to be on the show, and then all of a sudden her email, she must have changed email, and I've never been able to reach her. So you and I will be talking about that at a later.
Yes, I'll send you her email because she frequently stops at my house, and we have long visits. But she's been doing a lot of traveling.
Oh, I see. Yeah, but she was going to be on the show, or I can't remember how far we got with that, but I'd love to have her on. She's very interesting. So while we're talking about Montana, are there any stories that you got in that state?
Well, there are several, but now I'm trying to think of... Well, I told you the one about the man I met with the Universal Highway. That happened in Montana.
Oh, I see.
There was one that happened in Montana that one of my favorite characters, his name was Chauncey. And his granddaughter was a student of mine, and she came into my office one day, and I had that X-Files poster on my wall that said, "I believe," with the UFO on it. Mm-hmm. And she said my granddad would love that poster, and so I just took it down off the wall and rolled it up, and I said, "Take it to him when you see him." And she said, a couple of weeks later, she came back in my office, and she said, "My granddad loved that poster," and he said that if you're ever up our way to come stop and see us, she said, he's got a reputation that he's the only man that ever shot an alien. Well, that was just too much of a tidbit of information for me. So the next time I was on a reservation, I went in search of him. And, of course, he lived in a very isolated area. And he was out, shooting when I got there, shooting gophers. And he said, "You must be that lady from the university." And I said, "Yes." And so I shared my lunch with him, and I brought him some food and some tobacco, and he began to tell me the story. He said, "Now that you're recording this story, I better tell you the truth." He said, "I really didn't shoot an alien." He said, "I shot at one." And he said, "I was in the house one night, and he had a dog that he called his blue son. And he said, 'This is my boy. This is my son. All my other kids left me, but not this one. This is my only boy.' And it was obvious that he just loved this dog, and this dog loved him. Well, he was in his cabin one night, and the dog just started howling. And he said he opened the door, and the dog ran out into the night. And he said he grabbed his shotgun that was propped up by the door and went out after him. And he said he went around the back of the house, and he saw this creature or this being, and he said he was glowing. He said he was dressed in this. He described it like a child's pajama set, and he said he had my dog down on the ground, and I thought he was hurting my dog, and he said that he shot at him. And he said then the being stood up and came toward him and said that, you know, he didn't mean any harm, and told him that he came from the stars, and that he was a visitor. And so he said that he continued talking to him, and he said the sun started coming over the mountain, or over the horizon. And he said, so I said, well, you show me where your craft is. And he says that they began walking toward this huge boulder on his property, and he said that this being told him that it was behind this boulder. And he said that while they're walking, Blue Sun is walking with him, but staying clear of him. And he said that Blue Sun wants to play, so he would throw a stick, and the dog would bring it back and drop it at his feet. And when he told the dog to heel, it would heel, and when he told the dog to sit, it would sit. And this being became very interested in this dog. Well, when they round the boulder, there is this small craft, and he said it was not, it would only hold one or two people. He said very small craft. And he said that when they got there, that the being turned to him and pointed to his dog, and he wanted to take the dog with him. And he said,
pardon me, I hate to interrupt you. This is such a great story, but, you know, we're out of time. Can you believe it?
Really?
Yes.
Well, you're going to have to buy the book to find out the ending of it then, aren't you?
That's right. So you can find your book right on Amazon.com.
Right. And my website is www.sixkiller.com, and you can, anybody who wants to write me can write me at ardy@sixkiller.com. I answer all my emails myself. I read my emails personally, so it might take me a day or two or even a week sometimes, but I'll get back to you.
Okay. So that's it for our show. I want to thank a few people today, Carrie Lloyd Whitehouse and Bruce Rainier for the music, and Peggy Shunning for managing the Facebook page. Remember to like us on Facebook for all the latest UFO news. We have Mark Schwartz next week with Truth Funders, and he'll be on right here at 8 p.m. on the Dark Matter Radio Network next week, Wednesday, Eastern Standard Time, that is. And we'll see you next week. This is Martin Willis, and we're signing off. Keep your eyes to the sky.
Bye-bye, Martin.